Right. Welcome, everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome to Wednesday noon seminar. I'm Michelle Decker, professor here in the department and with the Center for Global Women's Health and Gender Equity. And so delighted to see so many people here in our live audience, and warmest welcome to those of us joining online as well for this noontime seminar. I'm especially delighted to present and introduce today's seminar because it allows us to really unpack the interface of economic opportunity, challenges to that, and how they interface with health, social outcomes, economic outcomes, safety outcomes. So many of us in the School of Public Health and in the university are really addressing that important area of economic opportunity and really getting into some of the gender equity issues there as well. Gender poverty, gender time use. How do we solve this? How do we quantify it? And how do we create the path forward? And so that was really the inspiration for this session. We're going to be focusing in this next hour on women's economic empowerment and unpacking how relationships can help, and also through hinder. And really within that, uplifting some of the methods innovation in this space across disciplines. Especially delighted to have two incredible scholars with us today. Dr. Anaise Williams, an assistant scientist here in the department and with the center, and Dr. Colleen Stuart, who is an associate professor over at the Carey Business School and the co-director of the new Gender and Health, Gender and Work Initiative. Both really cutting edge scholars at this interface of economic empowerment, economic outcomes, work, and really what does that look like? How do we move that needle forward? So I'm especially delighted to introduce this. I think we're going to have Anaise coming up first. So I'm going to invite you up and then we'll let you transition. And as always, for anyone that's new, we'll have some time at the end for questions and discussions. Oh, and I should mention as well, we've got some cookies and coffee after this session for those of you that are able to join us. So thanks. Welcome, Dr. Williams.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. So wonderful to be here. I love these Wednesday seminars and really excited to participate. So as Dr. Decker kind of mentioned, this is really a two-part seminar. So I'll be speaking first and then handing it over to Dr. Colleen Stuart. And I'll be discussing just a few different pieces of work that really touch on measuring gendered practices around women's economic participation, as well as examples of partner backlash and sort of control over women's economic participation. I'll start by kind of covering the importance of women's economic activity in broader gender equity goals. I'll discuss some strategies that we use at the center to kind of measure economic participation among women in relation to both the partner dyad as well as community normative effects, really taking this work kind of one step farther from what's sort of existing out there in the literature databases to think about the socio-ecological model, and we'll also talk about some examples. So I'll be discussing kind of two portfolios of work today, one being work that we do at the center in Kenya, originating from the PMA project here in the department, and the other being kind of more general work that we do drawing from demographic and health surveys. Excuse me. So just to back up a little bit, in 2015, the Global United Nations Millennium Development Goals were really revamped into the Sustainable Development Goals, with a timeline of reaching these goals by 2030. And as you can see, there's quite a diversity of goals here. We have 17 that really expanded from the original 8 goals that were proposed in 2000 in the Millennial Development Goals. And I'd like to draw your attention to Goal 5, which is on gender equality. And this was a really key milestone. It was really exciting to see this goal come through for the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals. While the Millennial Development Goals did have a gender equity focus, or a gender equity goal within itself, it was really kind of sparse. It focused just on education, wage employment, women's seats in national parliament. And we're seeing a lot of improvement here in the SDGs in terms of nuance and sort of detail on what sort of goals we want to see achieved to reach global gender equity. So I wanted to, of course, we have the first goal, very broad, ending discrimination against women and girls. but wanted to highlight sort of these pieces that really touch on women's economic empowerment and leadership, agency. An example sub-indicator for this 5.5, ensuring full participation in leadership and decision-making, is proportion of seats held by women in local government, as well as number of women in managerial positions. A sub-indicator of 5A, equal rights to economic resources. An example is share of women who own land, whether a country has a law that ensures equal access to inheritance rights, for instance. So really wonderful to kind of see these pieces of economic participation coming through in the SDGs. Can anybody tell me if we're on track? Does anybody know if we're on track to reach gender equity based on these goals by 2030? Yeah, I'm seeing thumbs down. Unfortunately, fortunately, we are not. It's not looking like we'll reach all of the goals by 2030. So in the latest UN 2024 report, only about 20% of these sub goals within goal 5 are on track. About 60% are marginally on track, making progress, and then 20% are just about stagnant. This is a really useful tool, the Global Gender Gap report, which is generated by the World Economic Forum. And it doesn't exactly reflect what's in the SDGs, but it's a really useful measure to look at sort of movement towards equity in economic participation, educational attainment, health and survival, as well as political empowerment. And what it's showing is the percent of the gap that's filled. So once we reach 100%, that means that there's equity between men and women. And so what we're seeing is there's been a lot of wonderful progress. We're really doing quite well in education and health, but only 60% of the economic gap is actually filled as of, this is 2023 data, and only 22% of the political gap. So we're really seeing economic, political, decision-making power among women really holding us back from reaching global gender equity. And just to add, the UN 2024 report also noted they estimate it will be 176 years from now until we achieve equal representation in managerial positions in the workplace. Excuse me. So to highlight this a little bit further, global labor force participation rates for women are just about 50% compared to about 80% for men. This graph, I think, is really useful. It's showing the gender gap in labor. So purple means more labor among men than women. Blue is about equal. Yellow is more labor participation among women as compared to men. And so we do see a couple countries in the world where there is gender equity in labor. Shout out to Canada. I don't know if anyone's from there. Oh yeah, Colleen. However, nowhere in the world do we see yellow, right? And I think this is really showing sort of a lot of purple, and therefore a lot of, it's really a strong message that we're seeing gendered practices in work, which is probably not surprising to anybody. And work is by no means a full picture of women's economic empowerment, but I think it's a really useful proxy to sort of understand these patterns. So when we think about measuring gendered practices, we really have to draw on social norms theory. And an easy way that I find really helpful to think about gender norms are really that they're kind of like the glue of the gender system. So they're holding everything together. They're kind of these unspoken social rules that govern the attributes and behaviors that are valued and considered acceptable for different genders. Norms are learned and reinforced from childhood through adulthood across the life course, through instruction, media, interaction, and social spaces. And the measurement of gender norms is definitely an evolving field. Different disciplines do it a little bit differently. But typically, when trying to measure norms through sort of a quantitative approach, we often look at patterns of behavior, prevalence estimates of behavior, patterns of approval or expectations of groups and how they should behave, both measured by people within that group or maybe outside the group as well. And so those are some of the practices that typically we see in trying to capture these in sort of quantitative data. So I want to provide an example of this, and this was work we did with our Nairobi youth cohort through PMA YRDS, Youth Respondent-Driven Sampling Project at the center. And as noted earlier, I'll be drawing from 2 portfolios of work. And one of these is data collection that's ongoing with youth and women across Kenya. And the exact project, I'll just note quickly, is at the bottom left-hand side of the slide, and then the sample is on the bottom right. So to provide an example of measuring gender norms through gendered behaviors, this is analysis that we did on gender stratified time use. This is among youth in Nairobi across the years of 2020 and 2021. And what we find is consistently in both years, we identified significant differences in paid work and unpaid domestic work, with young men participating significantly more in the former and young women more in the latter. And you can actually see almost kind of a substitution here. And I mean, I'll just note quickly, it was great to see that we actually didn't see significant differences in schoolwork among school-going youth. But, time use I wanted to showcase this because it's a really good example of sort of assessing patterns of behavior, how people spend their day. And here what we're seeing is that the way young people are spending their time is highly gendered and likely really to set up different trajectories across the life course. Another example is assessing expectations of community members. So here we ask in a survey with women of reproductive age in Kenya, what people in their community kind of expect in terms of gendered behaviors and expectations. We find, for example, that a little over 50% of respondents think that people expect boys and girls not to share household responsibilities equally. About 40% report that they perceive people believe that women should not have the same chance to work outside the home as men. So this is an example of kind of not capturing a behavior, but a perception of what's appropriate, right? Or essentially another way to think about the gender norm. So now that we've, I've covered norms a little bit, I wanted to share an exciting portfolio of work that we're doing at the center that's really exploring ways to kind of think about how individual behavior interacts with the community norm. So we sought to label the act of women being economically active. We were thinking about how do we compare this to the norm? So we sought to sort of label women as, or provide a status indicator of women who are economically active in a community where it's not normative for women to be doing that, to be economically active. And we're using the phrase Vanguard Women's Economic Empowerment, which I'll sometimes refer to as Vanguard WEE, as sort of that status label. And this is really drawing from the socio-ecological model, which many of you are probably quite familiar with, and this understanding that the environment and the individual experience really interact. So my personal behavior and its relationship to sort of the community norm on how people perceive I should behave, or how the group that I am perceived to belong to should behave, that relationship we're trying to understand how it impacts the lived experience of people, specifically women. So we sought to take this tool, a little bit away from theory and more into practice, drawing from the demographic and health surveys across low and middle income countries for a set of surveys that included economic measures. And so many of you are likely familiar with the DHS, but we drew from the women's surveys, and this is among women of reproductive age, and it's nationally representative, which is really awesome to kind of be able to talk about larger scale processes and relationships. So we set out to identify economic empowerment using a set of items available to us across these demographic and health surveys. This is a list of items that had enough sort of cross-national representation. For instance, working in the past year was around 50% of women across these 49 countries. And being the main decision maker on how to spend on earnings was about 20% of women. This is among partnered women. So we grounded these items within a framework of women's economic empowerment that's used quite widely across organizations and scholars that really centers not just on access to resources, but also the agency and control over those resources. So women's economic empowerment is really believed to be the resources, the agency acting together to lead to economic outcomes and well-being outcomes that an individual desires. So again, we didn't want to just measure women's economic empowerment. We specifically rather wanted to measure women's economic empowerment that goes against the women's economic empowerment norm, which I've noted before is termed Vanguard WEE. But to do this quantitatively, we first had to have a strategy for labeling a setting as not normative on an item. And so we did this based on community prevalence of an item or a behavior. And there's not a lot of research out there that does this, but there's a couple of papers published in quite strong journals that had some strategies that we drew from. And we played around with a couple different thresholds. But just to say, we landed on essentially this strategy here, which is saying a community is not normative for a behavior, say it's women's work, if women's work is less than 35% in that community. Or then we have this kind of gray area, right, of 35% to 65%, where we're like, oh, is that normative? Is that not normative? And so what we said, drawing again on other scholars that have done this, we said that if the community falls in sort of this gray area, we're going to say it's non-normative if it falls in the bottom 2/3 of the community level distribution within the community's specified region within the country. So this is just the strategy that we use to kind of say, okay, this community is normative, this one's not, and then we look at the individual behavior and its relationship to whether that community is normative or not. So being vanguard on an economic behavior is therefore having the behavior while living in a community that is not normative for that behavior. And we sought to create this index, which is essentially just very simple. It's the count of the number of behaviors that an individual does that is not normative. As you can see by the figure here, you need to have WEE to be vanguard on it, right? But they're not the same thing. So if you look at woman C and woman D, they're very different in terms of economic participation, right? Woman D is very economically active. However, she has the same number of vanguard items as woman C, who isn't as economically active, but all of her economic activities are non-normative. So just to show you kind of the comparisons here and how they're different, but also conditional. And just quickly, again, to make this point, so here, this is the average WEE score across different countries in the 49 countries that we were able to include in our sample, with lighter green being representative of countries with lower average women's economic empowerment and darker is higher average women's economic empowerment. And this is the Vanguard WEE score. Same thing, so lighter is lower Vanguard WEE score and higher is more. And again, this is partly driven by women's economic empowerment prevalence, right? Because you need to have WEE to be Vanguard on it. But as you can see, some places, such as South Africa, move from high women's economic empowerment, right at the tip of Africa, it's a little bit darker green, to quite less or more faded green for Vanguard. And that's likely because a lot of that women's economic empowerment is normative, right? So though it's high, we don't see much Vanguard because it's rather normative in South Africa. But then if you look at Kenya, excuse me, that's lighter for women's economic empowerment and gets a little bit darker with the Vanguard WEE. So that's showing that the WEE that does exist in this context is mostly non-normative among women, right? So for this portfolio of work and trying to kind of apply this measure of Vanguard WEE, we were really interested in whether partners can kind of use intimate partner violence as a practice to kind of limit and control women's economic empowerment. And further, pulling in the community normative aspect, when and where does this happen more often? Who's experiencing this more in terms of their partners controlling their economic activity? And so just, in terms of the theory around why we would see women's economic empowerment to lead to increased intimate partner violence, it's really centered on this concept of male backlash, in which if I'm a male or a man in a community and my partner is economically active, that could really threaten my masculinity. that could lead me to use violence to regain power, dominance, maybe using violence to even perform gender. So that's sort of the theory behind why, in some cases, in some research and also sort of both qualitative and quantitative research, we do see cases of women's economic participation leading to increased intimate partner violence. So to investigate this a little bit further using our Vanguard WEE measure, which I'll get to in a second, we pulled from the DHS different measures on intimate partner violence to explore, notably physical IPV, which across 44 participating countries was about 17%, past year sexual IPV, which was about 6%. And then we also had a measure of economic partner control in the form of a spouse not permitting the respondent to meet friends, limiting her contact with family, and insisting knowing where she is at all times. And so what we did is we regressed these different IPV outcomes on Vanguard WEE, adjusting for actual WEE because we really wanted to home in on the direct effect of what does it mean to be Vanguard in terms of your violence risk. And what we found is that while an increased number of WEE items was associated with less IPV risk, this is right here on the bottom, you see these negative marginal effects. An increased number of Vanguard or non-normative WEE items was actually associated with increased IPV, adjusting for each other, as well as a set of covariates, survey design, and weighting. For example, women that had no Vanguard WEE items was about 15% for physical IPV in this first part of the table, but that increased to about 19% for women that had more than had three or more Vanguard WEE items. So it's about a 4 percentage point increase. So while these findings are, cross-sectional and they're not causal, they definitely suggest that there is potentially male partner backlash to women's economic participation that is not normative, right? And the GBV field has been increasingly interested in, okay, sometimes we see the relationship between WEE and IPV, but who is experiencing that? And this is kind of adding insight into how the normative environment and the levels of socioeconomic model, or rather the community normative effect specifically, can really help explain that a little bit, right? It might be that male backlash is more common in places where women's economic empowerment is less normative. So, given that context, I also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some measurement work we're doing at the center, specifically focused on partner economic abuse, which is really an emergent form of gender-based violence. Really exciting to be working on this. There's not a lot of measurement knowledge on this out there. And it's related because, it's kind of another way to think about partner control and backlash over women's economic participation. So here we see that among partnered women of reproductive age in Kenya, almost a quarter are experiencing some form of partner economic abuse. And we're measuring it based on these 4 items here, which are partner forcing her to hand over money she has earned to him, partner keeping her from taking out a loan, partner keeping her from having a job, and keeping her from having money for necessities. So this is kind of, capturing partner control over women's economic agency and sort of the practice of not allowing women's economic agency and participation to really thrive. Using the same measure of economic partner abuse, we also see similar, if not actually higher prevalence, unfortunately, among youth in Nairobi, suggesting that this economic partner control, unfortunately, may start quite young. And what we see here is that partner economic abuse is also overlapping with other types of partner abuse, such as sexual and physical intimate partner violence. So though 35% of the young women that we surveyed for this experienced partner economic abuse, only 16% only experience partner economic abuse. And about 10%, you can see in the Venn diagram, are actually experiencing all 3 forms of this partner abuse kind of concurrently. So this is really important to highlight this overlap, I think, for practice and intervention, as well as to sort of understand these risk profiles overall. And, taking all this together, it's really suggesting that partner violent behavior in response to women's economic participation and sort of the activity of controlling it is really indicative of sort of broader gender practices that really undermine women's safety and well-being. Okay, so I think I'm at time, but just, some key takeaways I think are really, firstly, that global gender equity still has a long way to go. We're seeing progress, but there's a lot of work to be done. And the economic sphere is definitely a big barrier and something that we really need to invest in to get us to those global gender equity goals. Secondly, gendered economic practices are really persistent across the life course, as I hope, I've laid out to some extent, and applying the socioecological framework as well as social norms theory is really important for kind of measuring gendered economic practices. Lastly, partner backlash against and partner control over women's economic participation is really a critical threat that we should be thinking about to women's health and safety and a key barrier to reaching global gender equity goals. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hear me okay? Yeah, brilliant. Hi, good to see you. I see some familiar faces. I see lots of new faces. So it's my pleasure to be here. My name is Colleen Stuart. I'm an associate professor at the Carey Business School, which is kind of down the street in Harbor East. My research focuses on inequality and gender inequality in organizations and also collaborative work. And what you'll notice when I talk through some work in progress that myself and colleagues are working on, you'll notice that all of my contexts are US or Western contexts. Nonetheless, I think the broader themes I'm talking about, the mechanisms I'm talking about, and the ideas I think generalize quite broadly, and so I look forward to having a longer conversation about that. And certainly I think you're going to see connections between what I talked about in Anaise's work. I'm also, this is a shameless plug, I'm also the co-director of the Gender and Work Initiative, which is launching in December. And so what the point of the initiative is to really change the environment around working women to promote gender equality and equity. So we're really excited about that, which is coming up soon. So this isn't, the slide's not going to surprise anyone, right? So we know that women are underrepresented in positions of leadership, and this is true in Western contexts as well in the United States. So even though women hold half of the undergraduate degrees in the US and nearly just 50% labor force participation and enter organizations in the same proportion as men, women still remain underrepresented in high status, high powered and leadership positions. And this is true across academia, politics, and private industry. And so there are many reasons why this might be. There's a lot of evidence, a lot of conversation around it. I'm going to talk today about one little sliver of this, which relates to women's networks. And in particular, the set of projects that I'm going to talk about today, we're really interested in how women's kinship networks, when they intersect with occupations, how they might offset disadvantage that women commonly experience in work in organizations and occupations. So family and marriage, right? We know can be barriers to women's labor force employment. There's lots of historical legal reasons for why this is the case. And even currently, we know that family and marriage is associated with increased caregiving demands for women, perceptual penalties associated with motherhood, and perceptions of lower commitment from employers. And so there's a bunch of real and also perceptual reasons or expectations around women with family responsibilities that may either impact their ability to fully engage with work or affect how they are evaluated and perceived at work. At the same time, myself and my co-authors, we couldn't help but notice these funny anomalies that would pop up, right? So we know that the first woman president and prime minister were both married to other senior politicians. The US's first woman CEO, Anna Bissell, she assumed control of the Bissell company when her husband died. Both of our first Supreme Court justices were married to lawyers. And even if we look at Forbes' list, the last version of the 2023 most powerful women, and actually this has been consistent. We've been tracking this for years. This is very consistent. Six of the top men were married to men in the same occupational group. So we think that there is something going on here when it comes to women's networks, when their personal networks overlap with their occupational networks. And the way this usually happens is through some tie to male kin. So either a husband or a father, for example. And so what our intuition here is that these ties to male kin, they increase access to women's resources and information and may elevate their own status. And so this draws on a framework that's commonly used related to at the status and networks literature, which is the idea that networks can serve as both pipes and prisms. So they both affect the resources that we have access to, but they also affect how people view us. And so our thoughts is that this connection to male kin affects both of these pathways, which then benefit women in their careers. And by the way, we actually don't think that this is about nepotism. In all of our research, when we look at what are the attributes of women, everyone looks reasonably the same. We don't find differences between women who marry within an occupation versus out of occupation in terms of their skills or abilities or experience. We think that there's something else going on here in the network. So what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you a set of findings across 3 different data sets that looks at instances of overlap between kin and occupations. So the first one of them is something called occupational endogamy. All this means is that it's marriage within occupations. And so this is something that you'll hear me refer to as in marriage. So this is people go to law school and they get married. So then you have 2 lawyers who are married to each other. You have 2 physicians married to each other, right? This is just what it is. And it's actually fairly prevalent because people meet their spouses when they go to school, right? Or when they enter their first jobs or later jobs. The second instance are political dynasties. So these are families in which more than one member is involved in politics. So a very prevalent American example are the Kennedys, but you can also think, for example, Nancy Pelosi, originally from Baltimore. Her father served in Congress before she did, right? So that's another example of a political dynasty. Also more prevalent than you would think. So I'm going to show you a set of results right now that really speak to male kin and women's career outcomes. So this is a sample of Oscar-nominated actors. So we have men and women who are nominated for either Best Actor or Best Supporting Actor since 1936. And then what we do, and these are regression linear probability models with a whole bunch of fixed effects and controls, which I'm happy to talk about later. And what we did is we coded whether or not the nominee was single, whether they were married to someone within the occupation, so in married, so that would have been married to another actor, director, producer, writer, or whether they were out married, meaning married to someone outside of their occupation. And what we find is that I'm actually going to start with the second point. So what we find, and this is actually pretty consistent with the broader literature in sociology on marriage premiums and penalties. But what we find is that for men, being married is just good, right? Like being married is good for men's careers. It doesn't matter if you're married within your occupation or outside of your occupation, it's just good. And for women, the results tend to be a bit more mixed, right? So for women who were married outside of the occupation, their chances of winning or getting this big award or recognition from their peer group was lower by chance. So what's great about the Oscars is that there's almost always 5 people in a category. So we know the chances of winning just randomly by chance is 0.2. So we can see who is kind of, doing better than we expected, who's doing worse than we would expect. So outmarried women are below this 0.2 cutoff. Single women are above it, and then married women are also above that 0.2 cutoff. This is another data set looking at public sector workers. So these again are people who, what we do is we estimate their hazard or the risk of promotion over time, right? And so what we see is that again for men, so this is this top graphic, being married is good for men's careers. So regardless of whether you're out married or in married, you're more likely to be promoted compared to men who are single. And for women, what we find is that if you're single or married outside of the occupation, your risk of promotion is the same. And then women who are married inside of the occupation, their probability of their risk of promotion increases. These are data from women in US Congress. What we looked at here, and this is more about representation than about promotion or recognition, but what we find is that if we look at who has served in Congress and what their family history looks like, we find that almost 18% of women legislators were preceded by a close family relative. So this is since 1920. It's always so much. So we find that women compared to men are much more likely to be preceded in Congress by a relative. So there's something about these familial connections that help increase women's that are more meaningful for women's representation in these high power positions compared to men. What I want to spend a bit of time now is you're probably thinking, oh, this could be because of this, and this could be because of this, and we think there's multiple things going on. One obvious one is that if you have a spouse in the same occupation, you would benefit from maybe information that you get from your partner. Maybe the division of household labor is more equitable, right? There's all these sorts of these we put in a bucket of like these sort of intra-household effects. What I'm going to focus on now is some evidence that suggests that, and I think that's happening. I'm not saying that's not happening, but I'm going to focus on some evidence that says that also what might be happening is that women are perceived and treated differently by other people, right? So not the spouse, but third parties, or viewed differently and treated differently. So this is a kind of a tricky figure, but we're going back to our public sector workers, and this is where we saw that women who are married within the occupation have a higher risk of promotion compared to other women. And what we also ask these women is, what does your network look like? How many mentors do you have? Who do you go to advice? All these sorts of things. And I'll have to give you a bit of background. So one thing we know from the literature is that men's and women's networks typically look different and they operate differently. And there's good documented evidence to suggest that if you have like a really fully functioning network, we talk about, do you get returns on your contacts? So it's not just that like you know someone, but it's that they do things for you, right? They give you information, they put you up for opportunities, like they really kind of, like our sponsors, they stick their necks out for you and they help you with your careers. And so if this is happening in your network, what we would expect is that the more mentors you have, you're more likely to get promoted, right? You have these people helping you with your career, this should translate into some positive outcome for you. And this is typically what we see for most men. This is how most men's networks work. This is not how women, I'm sorry, all of you are entering the workforce, and this is so depressing, but this is not how women's networks always work. So women, the more mentors that women have, they don't necessarily get the same returns on those higher status contacts as men. And there's evidence to suggest that the best case scenario for most women is to have one sponsor, one mentor. And that leads to the best outcome. And that's what we see here, right? So for women who are out married, so married outside of the occupation, we see that when they have one mentor, this is when their risk of promotion is the highest, right? Interestingly, for these women who are in married, their networks work like men's. The more mentors they have, the more likely they are to be promoted, which is what we would expect from a typical man. Right? And we know what the men's networks look like, and we've done this for men, so this is what it looks like for most men. So which makes us think that women who are married or married to someone in the occupation, the people around them treat them differently, give them more resources, give them more opportunity, because their networks trends are positively associated with promotion where they aren't for other women. Women, so this is again going back to politicians. We also find that both men and women who have ties to kin, so who are part of these political dynasties, they win by a greater margin than, so this is voters. So this is, now we're talking about how do voters perceive candidates. They win by a greater margin than men and women who don't, right? So these blue dots are these people with these from political dynasties. But we find that the effect is greater for women, right? So the difference to women for having these ties to family that preceded them in Congress, the benefits for women are greater than they are for men. All right, so that's good. I can wrap up. Perfect timing. Okay, so overall, what we find is that male kin, and in most cases in our data set, these are fathers and husbands, are positively associated with women's recognition, promotion, and status, and mitigating often disadvantage that women see in occupations and organizations. We also find some early evidence to suggest that these benefits are not only conveyed by the kin, right? We don't think that these are just intra-family or intra-household benefits. We think that part of this effect has to do with the broader network in terms of how the broader network perceives the spouse or the daughter, and the resources that they then in turn convey to this person. That's it. So thank you very much. Do we have questions?
Yeah.
For both of us?
Yeah, you want to,
Yeah.
I'll let you handle the Q&A, but oftentimes we get an opportunity to both up there and.
Oh, should I go ahead and call? Okay. Yes, you in the light blue. Yeah.
Wanted to ask what were some of the indicators, the items that you took for the vanguard women while you were measuring the women economic empowerment?
Yeah, so the economic measures? Yeah, I can quickly go back to them because I know I went over those super quickly. So just to preface, these were very much limited by what was available across countries. And I think, if I had all the data in the world, it would be, probably a different list. But these first 4 items are very much supposed to focus on sort of the resources aspect of women's economic participation. So access to work, not only access to work, but what kind of work? Is it more professional, managerial work? And then earnings, but not just earnings, but actually earning the same or more than a husband, which as you would suspect was actually very low, or as you can see here, it was only 12% of women And then education, which we felt was sort of a proxy for a resource that leads to economic opportunity. And then these last 4 items are focused on decision making. So because these first 2 are more sort of relational, we coded them as participating in the decision making, either by oneself or with a partner. And these last 2 we coded as main decision making on accessing her own healthcare, which typically you need economic resources to do that. So we thought that was a proxy we could draw on, as well as main decision maker on her own earnings. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think yeah. Yeah, would you like to go?
Yeah. I have a comment about the first slides you began with, where you gave the statistics of women economic participation around the East Africa and some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. You said it was almost equal. So I want to understand that part where there is Uganda, Ethiopia, DRC. I want to understand what you use to measure that, because I don't know what you mean by almost equal considering as well as how much they're earning. Because you find, I'll give an example of human resources as well. There are more nurses or even HRA, human resources in healthcare that are women, more than the men, but then they are concentrated in a lower paying position. So what do you mean that it's almost equal? Is it for them to be earning whatever they are earning, or what do you mean?
Yeah, so actually, when I said almost equal, I was referring to the blue countries.
Yeah, that's the blue as well, you know.
Oh, these ones here. Yeah, got it. So this is just purely, so this is not our data. This is drawn from the World Bank, and it's purely looking at labor force participation rate. So you make an excellent point. It's not adjusting for type of labor, wages, or anything like that. It's purely looking at participation in any sort of economic activity. And so I think you make a great point that these blue countries in Africa, yes, we're seeing generally equal labor participation, but the type of work is probably very, very different. And this graph is not at all catching that. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It would be good to also highlight that maybe when we're debating that maybe we did not consider anything. Then I go back to the indicators, the indicator box that she was talking about. Were you only considering the people who knew how much their partners were earning? Because there is some statistics, especially the developing regions, that actually women don't know how much their husbands are earning. So which population were you looking at?
Yeah, so this is a question asked to women in the demographic and health surveys, and the response items are my husband earns more than me, I earn the same or more than him, or I don't know. And you're absolutely right. There was a large amount of missingness for that value, because a lot of, I don't remember the exact percentage, but there was a high percentage of women that said they don't know. Because I think you're mentioning the fact that a lot of husbands don't share their earnings, and of course there could be some measurement bias. Sometimes maybe it's a woman's judgment, like, don't know exactly what he earns, but I know it's more than me, or I think it's more than him. And that's something we deal with survey research. But that's how the data was collected. Yeah, great point. Thank you. Yes, back way in the back.
I have a question about the second presentation.
Yeah.
Especially for the network, like analyses with occupation, did your team look at any women who had a female partner in or out of the occupation? Is that like factored into that graphic?
So this is an important clarifying point that I forgot to make. We only look at heterosexual couples. We would love to look at same-sex couples. We just didn't have enough. Our theory too, though, is predicated on literature about gender as a status characteristic, which would suggest that women by default are lower status in many workplaces, and that male partners would be considered by default higher status. And so that's kind of the intuition that we built the framework for the study around. But nonetheless, I'd love to look at that. Our theory would suggest that, and this is actually something that we're trying to look at with different data sets, hopefully be able to get at this. But in these data that we have. But that's an intuition.
I also have a question about your presentation. You talked about the different types of sponsors, like the difference in sponsorship between men and women. And specifically you talked about like the impacts of those different types of sponsorship. So men tend to have more people actually do things for them than women do.
Yeah.
Did you look at like the makeup, like the gender makeup of the types of sponsors that they did have? Because I was thinking, you said that women who are in married, that their promotion was similar to men. Would that be because their sponsors are now their husband's sponsors essentially?
Great question. Well, so I can say they aren't sponsored by their husbands. I can say that because we know that. So the challenge with that data set is the respondents are anonymous, so we can't link couples. I will say though, which is interesting, is that women overall have more mentors who are women. And fewer who are men. And so it doesn't, my intuition is that it wouldn't purely be driven by that, but it's possible, right? So we would expect that in the setting, definitely people would benefit from building relationships. So when people get married, right, it's the union of two networks. So we would expect that women would benefit from their husband's network and the husbands would benefit from their wives' network. But what we can also tell is that women, as we would expect, also have more mentors who are women. So we do see some variation on that, but I can't definitively say.
Because that would also have implications for how much they can sponsor you, because there's not that many women that are in positions to sponsor other women.
Yeah, and we know that women who are in high ranking positions, they end up doing a lot of that work and they're overworked. That doesn't seem to be a problem for women who are in married. So they have more women in their networks, but that doesn't seem to be a problem for them or for them. Go ahead.
All right, Sally, and then I think Kelsey will give first.
Oh, go ahead.
Obviously, these are huge problems, and I'm interested in sort of interventions or solutions. And I think it's interesting to see if there's any like things that cross over between the local setting and the very different but similarly rooted problems in high settings that either of you develop.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So I can talk a little bit about more kind of in the global context. There's a lot of work going on, I think, and it definitely depends on, it's sort of population specific in terms of income level and educational level and things like that. A very common example of an intervention to promote women's economic empowerment in low income groups is like microfinance, or giving small loans to start a business, things like that. And in terms of the impact on partner backlash, I think the main sort of messaging around that is that it needs to be coupled with social norms change or work with husbands and things like that. But that sort of thing, like the World Bank and other organizations that focus a lot on poverty alleviation among women focus mostly on that. In terms of more professional women in low-income contexts, there's things like programs that offer wage subsidies or kind of incentives for organizations to hire women. For example, as well as social norms work with families to kind of get at the reasons as to why women aren't economically active, and if there's sort of family reasons as to why we see that. That's a super quick response, but I don't know if you want to comment on the US.
Yeah, so this is really tricky for us because we our recommendation isn't just like, oh, marry someone, marry someone from your program and your life will be better. That's not. Although, sure, go ahead, marry someone from your program, but don't do it for this reason. Yeah, don't do it for this reason. Yeah, so this is tricky, right? I think what we're trying to figure out is what aspects of this are generalizable more broadly, right? So what is it about, and this is why we're kind of continuing doing some experiments and ongoing things, is to figure out, is it just that, so there's lots of things about this that are really, really tricky, but is it that, just this is like a really strong signal of an endorsement that makes women's lives a lot easier at work. And we really need to do work within organizations among leaderships to really create that opportunity and really, drill down on men's allyship in organizations, right? Like, whether we can make that leap right now, I think we're still figuring that out. But one thing that we're constantly talking about, and it's current events are really kind of fascinating and interesting for this, but when we think about Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, like he set a very strong endorsement for her that cleared the field and removed any competition from a primary, like from inside the party. And is it these types of strong endorsement? Is this essentially just a really strong endorsement of someone who otherwise people would be have a lot of uncertainty about or be critical of, that essentially just resolves that? And so that's kind of one angle that we're thinking about. And again, it comes back to men's allyship, right? And I think, our reviewers said this to us, which I think is really interesting, which is, this is kind of like some counterfactual experiment where there's no bias against women. And I'm not saying there's no bias against these women, but it's kind of like this alternate reality where like things just function the way they should. Networks work the way they should, and people can form relationships like they need to. And so I think just from even like a thought experiment, I think it's also kind of interesting. But we're still kind of trying to figure that out exactly. It's a great question.
Thanks, Sally, and then we can look back to, oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sort of caught up on the point where women out of network, like it was more beneficial to have only one mentor, like
Why?
Yeah.
So the logic about this is that, and this is something that's, was documented 20 years ago, right? And it doesn't only apply to women, but it also applies to just anyone who might be perceived as illegitimate, so an outsider. So the researcher who documented this effect also found it among, for example, like men who were new to a job. So it's like, if you have outsider status, going in and building relationships with high-ranking, powerful people tends to be viewed as inappropriate by others, which then makes your network less useful if it's viewed as illegitimate, right? So if the affiliations or the relationships we build are viewed as inappropriate or illegitimate, they aren't as useful to us. So what this researcher found is that men who are like mid-career or senior career could do this no problem. Women had this problem at all stages of their careers.
Yeah. Yeah, whichever, I didn't know which one had their hand first, yeah.
Okay, so still on the BD, I like the focus on the ecological model. But did you try to assess the implication of women empowerment on IEPB at the individual level for married people? Because there's a tendency whereby when in some relationships, when women are economically empowered, it actually increases IEPB.
Yeah, so this, the analysis presented here is at the individual level. So that Vanguard WEE measure is actually measured at the individual level. So it's saying whether I am economically active in a way that is non-normative, me personally at the individual level. So it's kind of like a measure that's at the individual level, but it's comparing to the community norm. So we had the overall women's economic empowerment measure, as well as the Vanguard. And basically, absolutely, you're completely correct that generally we do see that women's economic empowerment can lead to increased IPV risk. And it's kind of a question of, okay, like why is that happening sometimes? Because we also see that sometimes it leads to better, IPV outcomes in terms of women who are more economically empowered have better resources to leave a relationship. They have potentially better social networks. They have less economic dependency on a partner, so they're not, they don't have to stay for those reasons. So what we find is that adjusting for the actual economic empowerment level, being economically empowered in a way that's not normative is risky. So that's kind of our main sort of finding there, was that this male backlash is more likely, backlash against economic empowerment is more likely when economic empowerment is non-normative. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thank you for that question.
All right. Wow. Exactly the conversation that we were really hoping to stimulate and to have by bringing really two scholars into the space and really thinking about the ways in which these help and hinder, and how do we unpack that? I was reflecting as well. We often think about, economic status, marriage as like, they're kind of in our table one, they're the demographic factors, and you're giving us so much more coming to unpack when we think about how is that working to create risk and to create resilience for people. So I want to invite everyone, the folks that are able, join us for some onward conversation and cookies on the other side of the hall after this. And please join me in just giving a really warm thanks again to Dr. Williams and Dr.